This C300 Mark II review will not necessarily focus on all the sexy specs that most people refer to when pitching this camera, but rather the things that have ended up mattering the most positively or negatively on my real-world client shoots and projects. If at the end of the review you want to pick up one of these, I do have eBay affiliate links in the description below. This camera is a Netflix-approved camera. Now, you and I may actually never do a piece for Netflix, but the Netflix approved camera list has basically become a standard for video on demand platforms. At least to the extent that if your camera is Netflix approved, you know that it will be able to get on pretty much any streaming platform or online service that is out there. You don't have to be producing content for Netflix for this to be valuable. It is nice to know that this camera has what it takes to shoot super professional content for any kind of online distribution. So how about we ping pong back and forth between features that I like and don't like out of this camera before concluding with who it's great for and where it falls short. Let's go. My absolute favorite feature of this camera has to be the color science and bit depth that it can achieve. This really should be no surprise. 10-bit color and the Canon C-Log2 profile with C-Gamut gives an incredibly flat image, rich with color grading potential. I have found it especially pleasing in the way that it renders skin tones when shooting outside or with a professional lighting kit. That said, I have found that in mixed lighting scenarios, the color capabilities tend to fall short, and I have struggled to recreate a believable or even a realistic rendering of an object or person, which kind of surprised me. The ability to isolate colors and control all of their values is unbelievable coming from my background with the C100 Mark II, which only shoots 8-bit color. I feel very empowered to be able to create gorgeous grades in post when shooting with this camera, whether it be realistic or a stylized grade. And that is just my experience with 10-bit color. This camera can also shoot 12-bit color in HD, which would probably blow my mind if I attempted it. I think the color capabilities out of this camera will be one of the first things that you will fall in love with, like it was for me. It's just phenomenal. So what's something I really don't like about this camera? Well, number one has to be the autofocus. Within the menus, this camera says it can do things like face detection, face only or face priority, boosted manual focus, center frame, continuous autofocus, or selectable tracking. Lots of different autofocus options. Since I was upgrading from the C100 Mark II, and this camera was a few years newer, I thought that I would be able to notice a big difference in the autofocus technology. Actually, I was. It's a lot worse. This camera really struggles to find what it should be focusing on and lock in on it, and it will continually search back and forth and then take a really long time to establish focus, and then even lose focus once it's established that focus. Nearly every professional shoot that I've used it on, I switch off of manual focus literally within a few seconds because it's giving me so many fits. In fact, the only time I now use the autofocus on this camera is for these YouTube videos that you are watching right now. Well, not right now, but the ones that I've been posting in the last few months. One caveat here is the focus guide feature is truly a joy to work with in manual focus, and since you're probably going to be shooting manual focus on this camera, this is one feature you will love. It's a display marker that tells you whether or not the object behind the guide is in focus and how far you have to rack focus to achieve true focus. Watch how the little triangles move in together as we get closer to focus and then turn green when we achieve focus, and then back away from each other when we go too far. Super helpful. Let's focus on another positive, shall we? That would have to be the sharpness and resolution. Obviously, this camera can shoot 4K, but even its 1080 is incredibly sharp. Combined with the color science, it constantly is putting out a gorgeous image that is so pleasing to look at. Now, the sharpness does not feel artificial or unbelievable. Skin tones and soft textures still retain the softness about them that we sense in real life. The textures are stunning out of this camera and truly look above and beyond professional. You can immediately tell that this was not shot with a DSLR or entry-level cinema camera. So what's a drawback feature? Well, it relates to my two top pros that I love about the camera, and that is the file sizes. This is inevitable when shooting such high resolution and large color bit depth. Still, coming from the C100 Mark II, which only uses about 9 gigabytes an hour of footage, the comparative bit rates and storage requirements for this camera are pretty astounding. Now, there are two options when it comes to shooting in 1080, long GOP and intra frame. And I have shot with both, and honestly the only tangible difference I can sense in any part of the experience is how much space each file takes up. Supposedly long op can create issues in post-production with lags or dropped frames, or for color grades, but so far I have not run into any issues. When 1 hour of long op footage takes up 20 gigabytes of storage, and 1 hour of intra-frame footage takes up 70 gigabytes of storage, I think you can tell which format I would recommend filming in 1080, when this is the only noticeable difference that I have experienced. Now when we get to 4K, the bitrate and storage consumption is massive. 1 hour of footage will consume 180 gigabytes of hard drive space. And this means you will only be able to store about 5.5 hours of footage for every terabyte hard drive. Compare that to well over 100 hours of footage that you could put on the same hard drive using the C100 Mark II. Now that's the cost of 10-bit color 4K footage. Is it worth it? Yes, for many projects it will be, but just be prepared to go out and purchase hard drives much more frequently than you may be used to. 20 times more frequently, to be precise. Shall we bounce back to a feature I love? We shall. The next thing I love most about this camera is probably the internal ND. This camera has up to 10 stops of internal neutral density at its disposal. You can choose from 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 stops of internal ND. Now coming from a camera that only had 8 stops of ND, this upgrade has made investing in a matte box or additional ND filters unnecessary for me. I don't think I have been in a situation in which I am losing lots of highlights even when shooting in full sunlight with this thing. The dynamic range of this camera is truly a joy to work with. So back to a negative. The size, weight, and form factor of this camera is significant for a cinema camera. This makes gimbaling extremely limiting, at least with the Moza Air 2 that I have, and certainly taxes the arms when gimbaling or hand holding. You can check out a video that I did on this to show that it is possible to use this camera with a gimbal. It's just not a whole lot you can do with it. Now at the risk of turning this negative into a positive, the added size and weight certainly smooths out my handheld footage. C100 Mark II is nearly impossible to use as a handheld camera because of how comparatively light it still is. But this camera really anchors itself down with a little warp stabilizer in post, and I can get some really solid results. Still, it's very heavy to transport and a beast to operate with when not on a tripod. I've not shot enough with it to know how much of an issue I would consider this in the long run. At this rate, I do like the size and the weight for operating, but I don't like it for transportation. I'm also highly discouraged, of course, from using it on a gimbal. Now the next feature that I absolutely love out of this camera has to be the top handle and this particular LCD screen. This camera has 2 different LCD screen options, and I have only experience with this one, but I love so much about it that I would not want to try the other one. The screen has great articulation, plenty of buttons and controls, nice and bright, and has been one of the most pleasing screens to work with in my experience. This top handle is big and very solid and actually makes operating this camera a true joy. It also has more accessory attachment capabilities on it than I know what to do with. What's incredible about the hot shoe options alone is the number of orientations that I can put this LCD screen on the camera for every kind of scenario I need. From operating in front of a camera like these YouTube videos, to hand holding, to putting on a tripod in tight spaces, the placement options accommodate every position and scenario that I need. The only downside to this top handle is it's so solidly built and attached to the camera that it requires an Allen wrench to unscrew 2 screws that fasten it to the camera, and this means it's not a quick operation to pack the camera away in a traditional hard case or to unpack it and get ready to film. That said, if you can lay the camera down on its side with the top handle on in your hard case, then setup is almost completely non-existent. And I was fortunate enough to have a situation in which this was possible, and this camera was by far the fastest and most convenient to pull out of a case and begin filming that I have ever experienced myself. So as long as you can transport the camera with the top handle on it, I think this will be the best top handle experience you may ever have. Now to another negative. The exposure on this camera is a little tricky without an exterior monitor. This camera does not support false color, which would be the best exposing method, though you can find an accessory monitor that would support false color out of this camera. The flat color profile is gorgeous to work with in post, but it can also make exposing on set tricky. I believe you can load a lot into the camera to display, but I have not tried that myself. So though exposing can be a little tricky on this camera, the nice thing is its dynamic range and color science allows for pretty solid recovery in post if you happen to be getting a bad exposure on set, at least as long as you're within 1 or 2 stops. Now the buttons and menu navigation is pretty intuitive. All of the controls that you really need are easy to access on the camera body itself, and they have a bonus feature of lighting up in a dark room. I found it fairly intuitive to be able to change all of the settings that I needed and even customize some of the buttons, at least for someone who is used to Canon. A newbie will probably find some of the settings confusing to locate within the menus, no doubt. When you're on set working with a client and you need to make an adjustment, it's very important to be able to find what you need as quickly as possible and make the change. For me, this camera allows me to do this very, very well. Okay, 2 positives in a row, but this one is going to act both as a positive and a negative, and that is the audio capabilities out of this camera. Now they are great. It has great preamps, it has 2 XLR options, but they're on the LCD screen. I've always had a phenomenal audio out of this, and it allows me to run both a shotgun mic and a wireless lavalier mic to get great sound. The sound controls on the camera are accurate and yield very pleasing results. The negative side of this for me, as I've alluded to, is that the XLR ports are on the detachable LCD screen here, and I really wish that they were somewhere on the camera body itself. If I wanted to add an accessory screen to give me like false color for exposure or bigger screen to be able to monitor, something like that, I still have to have this detachable LCD screen on if I want to run sound, and this just adds a lot of weight and bulk that I wish wasn't a prerequisite. The last negative that I have to say is that almost all shooting formats on this camera have to write to a CFast card, not an SD card. The only issue I have with this is that my MacBook Pro does not have a CFast port in it, so I always have to remember to have a special adapter in order to download my footage to my computer. This little thing here. If it wrote to SD card, this would not be an issue, but obviously the kinds of files that this camera is creating will not write on SD card. Maybe the solution is actually for Apple to put a CFast port on their MacBook Pro. So who is this camera for and who is it not good for? Well, first off, this camera is fabulous for documentary filmmakers. This is the best camera option for entry-level documentary filmmaking because it is the most affordable Netflix-approved Canon cinema camera. It has all you will need on a documentary shoot, equipped for exquisite image quality and sound quality, and super convenient package that is very easy to shoot with. Menus and buttons are fairly easy to access to make any kind of setting changes that you need. A high-quality multi-channel audio on the camera is easy to set up for run and gun documentary or a sit-down interview. For commercial videographers who have been in the business for a couple of years, this camera also makes a really solid upgrade from C100 Mark II or DSLRs or anything else you've been shooting. That said, if you do a lot of gimbal work, I would not recommend this camera. I would also not recommend this camera as an entry level for someone getting into videography. For that, you want to spend a lot less money and make sure you can really make it as a business in this industry. Spend a couple years getting your feet wet, then upgrade to something like this. The C100 Mark II would be a better choice. That would come in at a much lower price point and still get you great image quality. And that goes for event videographers and sport videographers as well. The file sizes are just way too big and the quality more than you will need for most events, so go with the C100 Mark II again for that kind of work. It's not great for sports videography because of the autofocus. The autofocus is just so unreliable and you're most likely going to be wanting to depend on that. For those of you doing narrative shorts or low budget independent features, this camera does provide a lot of options to keep your costs lower and get you great quality. For these projects, RAW capabilities are available in external recording. I've not tested this out, but I've seen that it is possible. And that's it for this one, folks. Though I won't be seeing you in the next video, you're sure to see me rough.